Hey guys, it's chapter 20. Whose government? Politics, Populists, and Progressives, 1880 to 1917. We'll look at the beginnings of progress. Then we'll look at progressive presidents with an emphasis in Theodore Roosevelt, a little bit in William Howard Taft, and then again an emphasis in Woodrow Wilson. And we'll finish it up with African Americans. So we'll start with a flowchart of the late 1800s. Recall from 1870 to 1900, that was considered the Gilded Age, which was an age full of political corruption, stagnation, meaning little growth, and patronage. Patronage is the idea of granting government jobs to supporters. When President James A. Garfield becomes president as a Republican, 6 months later, he is shot by Charles Guiteau on July 2nd, 1881, for being left out of government. Charles was promised a government job, and President Garfield forgot about giving him the job that he had promised him. So since Garfield dies, his vice president, Chester A. Arthur, now becomes president, and he passes the Pendleton Act. See, Garfield's assassination scared Arthur because of the whole idea of patronage, and he wanted government jobs to be filled by people who knew what to do. And that's what the Pendleton Act of 1883 was supposed to do. Government jobs were to be filled by exams, meaning merit, people who knew what they were doing, skills and knowledge, over patronage, people who got the job because of being friends of the winning person. Both Garfield and Arthur were Republicans, but after a while Republicans were disillusioned by what was going on in the Republican Party, so they eventually started to support Democrats. One of them being the next president, which was Grover Cleveland, and we'll talk a little bit about him. Under Arthur's presidency, the Bureau of Labor Statistics thus began to investigate workplace safety and unemployment in 1884, and this is a whole idea of progress. People were kind of tired of the horrible living and working conditions, so the idea of progress was that society was going to improve. Well, here it is, President Grover Cleveland. He is a Democrat. He actually serves 2 terms. The first one that we're going to be talking about is 1885 to 1889. He then serves again from 1893 to 1897, the only president to serve 2 terms that were non-consecutive. As president, he begins to veto a lot of bills that would provide pensions for Union soldiers, and so Union soldiers were not very happy with him. Then, under his presidency, he does sign the Interstate Commerce Act, which was again a way to try to help the people. In 1887, the ICA was to limit corporate power, specifically railroad companies, but it lacked strength and it lacked power. So unfortunately, while the act was a good attempt, it lacked the power to actually do something powerful. So in 1889, President Benjamin Franklin becomes president. He is also a Republican. And under his presidency, he passes the Sherman Antitrust Act, which made it illegal to restrain or limit trade among companies. And that led to limiting the powers of monopoly. See, if Company A had a monopoly to the point that Company B couldn't really compete with Company A, that was restraining trade. So the Sherman Antitrust Act made it so that Company A does not hold all the power. After a while, people started getting tired of President Benjamin Harrison. So in 1892, we have a new presidential election. Our flowchart continues with the notes there. Now in 1892, we do have a combination of people who are the Farmers Alliance and Knights of Labor. So these are naturally farmers. The Knights of Labor are people who are working in industries. They combine to form a new political party. The political party becomes known as the People's Party. Later it became known as the Populist Party. The Populist Party in 1892 elected James B. Weaver to run for president. The Democrats nominated Grover Cleveland again, and the Republicans nominated the current president at that point, which was Benjamin Harrison. Now, James B. Weaver, this is a map that shows you the support that he got in the West for the most part. So states where there was over 50%, that means that the populist people were gaining support there. And then there were other states who didn't get as much, but they were there. Now, this is what the populists wanted. 1, they wanted a stronger government to protect ordinary citizens and oppression, injustices, and poverty. 2, they wanted public ownership of railroads and telegraphs. What that means is that private companies could no longer run the railroads, but rather it was a public affair that the government would take over and establish proper rates. The third goal on the populist agenda was to protect the protection of land from monopolies and foreign investors so that land could be conserved and preserved. The fourth goal was a federal income tax on people who were making a lot of money so that those people could then help the economy. And the fifth goal for the populist agenda was a monetary policy to help people who borrow money so they could pay it back easier. Now, the Populist Party did not win, but it did genuinely threaten the establishment of both parties, Republicans and Democrats, because the Populist Party were a party that was for the most part fighting for the poor and fighting for the oppressed. People wanted that change. They wanted something different, and the Populist Party was giving them that opportunity. However, because they were not a very strong political party, for the most part, you see the results were on the West, they did not win. So President Grover Cleveland served his second presidency from 1893 to 1897. Immediately once he steps into office, there's an economic depression. And remember, Cleveland is a Democrat. So the Republicans quickly blamed President Cleveland for the economic depression. There were other monumental causes of the economic depression, such as foreign countries were no longer investing in American property. Farms also foreclosed, and railroads filed for bankruptcy. So these, for the most part, were the main causes of the economic depression in 1893. The effects was that banks were unable to provide money for the people who had deposited their money. So you could imagine how citizens were upset. They would go to a bank, deposit their money, with the hopes that whenever they needed that money, they could come back and withdraw that money. But the banks had used up all the money of the people who had deposited. As a result, over 500 banks were forced to close and thousands of businesses went bankrupt, and unemployment hit a record high of 20% in the 19th century. Now, one way that the economic depression could have been fixed a little bit was what the progressives were calling for, an income tax on the wealthy. And eventually it reached the Supreme Court. A case there reached the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court in 1895, amidst the economic depression, struck down a law that would have taxed the wealthy, and as such, made the economic depression or prolonged the economic depression. And again, for the most part, the people, the middle class, they were tired of all this and they wanted change. But it seemed like change wasn't coming, at least not under these presidents that we are considering here. To make matters worse, Cleveland and the Democrats then considered themselves the white man's party. They intimidated, harassed, and shot blacks to keep them from voting for populist candidates because the blacks, they liked what they heard from the populists, since the populists were going to be helping the poor and many African Americans were poor. So anytime a black person would go to the polls, most likely they would now be voting for the populists, and the populists, the Democrats, they don't want that. They didn't want to lose power. So as such, they intimidated African Americans who wanted to vote, and they continued with the Jim Crow laws. If you remember those, literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clause. Now the grandfather clause was eventually removed, but other methods, tactics that whites used was lynching of African Americans and, like I mentioned, shooting them. So these were not only scare tactics, but terror tactics to keep African Americans from voting. And here's a particular example. In Grimes County, Texas in 1898. Now this county, for the most part, was predominantly African American. And many of the African Americans there that went to vote, they either voted populist or Republican. Well, the Democrats didn't want to lose power in the South. So what happened was a group of Democrats, which again, they were considered the white man's party, they began to attack African Americans. The sheriff, who was a populist sympathizer, was also kicked out of the town. After the Democrats killed the sheriff's brother, they took over the town for the next 50 years, making sure that the town, for the most part, be voted Democrat. So this is a particular example of how the Democrats, in this time, under President Cleveland, were not doing anything for African Americans. And all of these forced African Americans to stop voting. In some places, voting dropped by as much as 40%. This map tells you the disenfranchisement of African Americans. So the pink, this is for everything that you see here is the South. The pink here is the disenfranchisement by states' constitutional amendments. So a state will pass an amendment that would forbid African Americans from voting. Other ones were disenfranchised by poll taxes and other devices. And this dark brown color, where counties where over 50% of the population was African Americans. But yet again, even though a county had the majority African Americans, they were disenfranchised, which was obviously a political injustice towards African Americans. So again, people wanted to change. In 1896, we have a presidential election. William McKinley, a Republican, defeats William Jennings Bryan, a Democrat, and William McKinley, the Republican, then becomes president. He serves from 1897 to 1901. Now, during this presidential election in 1896, both parties, Democrats and Republicans, limited the number of immigrants, African Americans, and poors from voting because, again, many of these immigrants, African Americans, and the poor were going to vote populist, and they didn't want to lose that power. So they eliminated the number of immigrants, African Americans, and poors that were allowed to vote. Now, in a time of change, McKinley was not the person to be elected. McKinley was pro-business. He was not reformer. He was not a progressive. In his two campaigns, he spent $3.5 million. And people began to wonder about political and corporate corruption and how is it possible that one person could be funded $3.5 million while the rest of the country suffer in poverty. By the time 1897 comes around, the economic depression of 1893 pretty much ends, and Americans were now ready for progress, and McKinley was not that president. The middle class and the elite began to gain power, and they wanted change. But with McKinley in power, that change was not going to happen. Well, luckily for them, on September 14, 1901, Leon Cholskov shot President McKinley. His vice president, President Theodore Roosevelt, is then sworn in as president. So, as the 20th century begins, a new era of politics also begins. The federal government will now fight for its people against all possible threats, including corporations, trusts, foreign investments, and foreigners. So, with this, we see the beginnings of the progressive presidents. Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. We'll do Theodore Roosevelt here. So, in 1902, we have coal miners who go on strike in Pennsylvania. They were demanding a 20% increase in an 8-hour workday, the right to organize, but mine owners refused. 5 months into the strike, the country was running low on coal, and winter was fastly approaching. Roosevelt then summons both the owners and workers alike, but owners were unwilling to negotiate, so Roosevelt threatened to take over the mines. Eventually, the owners were forced to cave in. The coal strike was resolved. This gave hope to Americans that the federal government was actually looking out for the public's best interests and that labor disputes could be settled in an orderly fashion. In 1902, Roosevelt passes the New Lands Act. This was money from the sales of public land in the West that was used to fund large-scale irrigation projects such as the Roosevelt Dam in Arizona. The Roosevelt Dam provided water for irrigation, flood control, and electricity as well. In 1903, Roosevelt passes the Elkins Act, which prohibited railroads from giving rebates to certain clients only. In addition, railroads had to publish their fees in public newspapers so that people knew how much they were going to pay before they even got into the railroads. In 1904, Roosevelt asked the Department of Justice to sue the Northern Security case, which was a railroad. The Northern Security Railroad held a Northwestern monopoly, which was a clear violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act because it prohibited trade. So, the Supreme Court sided with Roosevelt, and the Northern Security Company was forced to dissolve. This gives Roosevelt the name Trust Buster. Major companies that control a lot, monopolies, were called trusts. So Roosevelt was busting these trusts. In 1906, we have the Square Deal when he runs for president. This is a progressive program and is known by the 3 C's. Control of corporations, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources. And the 1906 Hepburn Act is an example of the control of corporations. The ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, was set to shipping rates. So railroad companies no longer could charge whatever they wanted. The ICC was forced to do that. In 1906, here's an example of consumer protection. The FDA was approved and the Meat Inspection Act was passed. And finally, conservation of natural resources. Roosevelt eventually established 3 national parks: Mesa Verde in Colorado, the Grand Canyon in Arizona, and Mount Olympus in Washington. And he also then establishes the U.S. Forest Services in 1905.